see. Okay.
Ooh. Okay.
All right, should we start?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. Today we have a presentation titled Articulating Worlds Interviews as Third Space by our presenters Jazmine Harris and Stephanie Koch. Through photography, video, and text, Jazmine Harris deconstructs personal, communal, and political narratives. Memory, both found and fabricated, serves as her primary material. The acts of remembrance inform and shape the processes she employs. As she addresses the beauty and failure of collective memory, Jazmine seeks to mine, archive, and reimagine impressions left on the personal as one navigates the everyday familiar and unknown. Jazmine holds an MFA from the University of Chicago and a BS from Florida A&M University. Stephanie Koch is a facilitator and curator from Chicago who engages in an institution building as a creative practice and exhibition making as a site for prefigurative politics. Stephanie received a BA in political science from the University of Chicago and an MA in visual and critical studies from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Currently, she is a curatorial resident at Chicago Artists Coalition and a co-founder of ANUS, a studio and residency space focused on collaborative processes. Thank you guys for being here.
Yeah. Thank you for having us. Okay, so I'm gonna hop right in if that's okay, and we'll go ahead and get started. I'm gonna share my screen, or can I do that? It's not allowing me to share my screen.
You should be a co-host, so you should be able to.
Might be because Jazmine left and came back.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let me make you a co-host again.
Okay, awesome. So I'm gonna get started here. We can share that. One moment and get started on the slideshow. Okay. Can everybody, I'm gonna assume you can see the title slide of our presentation.
Yep.
And I'm gonna get started. I do just want to start this conversation by thanking Sophie, Adriana, as well as Rachel for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I also want to thank Stephanie, my co-presenter, for agreeing to do this with me. This is a first for me, so it's exciting to have Stephanie kind of ride along with me. So to hop right in, there was a video link that was sent out, I think 2 days ago with the registration for this presentation. If you did not have the opportunity to watch the video excerpt, it's totally okay. But I did want to briefly talk about some time that Stephanie and I took in an effort to put together this presentation, to talk to each other and to take a moment to define what third space meant to us personally. Third space is a term that I use quite frequently when talking about my thesis work and spaces I wish there were more of in the world. But I wanted to hone in on how it exists and could exist within dialogue. I wanted us to think about how our personal definitions of third space have evolved since we've gone virtual. I wanted us to explore the differences that might exist as an artist versus a curator when it comes to defining that space. But for those who might not know what third space is, I'll share with you my personal definition. For me, third space has always been a space that welcomes and rewards vulnerability. It allows and acts for the removal of any mask that one might wear to safely navigate the world that frequently others. It's a space where community is celebrated and differences are acknowledged. It's the in-between space between two unfixed identities. Sorry, I'm just gonna move our screen over if I can. So I did not come up with third space. Third space is actually a concept that Homi Bhabha, a post-colonial theorist, created and that I became familiar with during my time at University of Chicago during grad school. In The Location of Culture, Homi Bhabha writes, what is theoretically innovative and politically crucial is the need to think beyond narratives of originary and initial subjectives and to focus on those moments or processes that are produced in the articulation of cultural differences. These in-between spaces provide the terrain for elaborating strategies of selfhood, singular or communal, that initiate new signs of identity and innovative sites of collaboration and contestation, and the act of defining the idea of society itself. It's the in-between space for me that has always been of interest as an art. In-between space has always been of interest to me as an artist. When I got to grad school, it was Homi Bhabha's theory of third space, as well as the work of Gwendolyn Brooks and Anna DeVere Smith and other figures within the post-colonial canon, who offered me a language and a body of work to create from and within. Okay. You can go next. Cool. Well, taking performance nonfiction with Leslie Danzing and Emily Hooper Lasmia, I began an interview project that would evolve over the next few years and become the ongoing and central part of my artistic practice. Inspired by Gwendolyn Brooks's first book of published poems, A Street in Bronzeville, and Anna DeVere Smith's theater work, specifically Twilight and Fires in the Mirror, I began interviewing people on Washington Park Court, the block I grew up on, for the development of a one-woman show. It wasn't just the fact that Gwendolyn Brooks had come from Bronzeville for me and my interest in her text, but it was really the way she visually described kind of the people and the architectural spaces within this poem or within this book of poems that really interests me. In addition to Anna DeVere Smith, it was, her performance techniques, but also there's an interview I was able to kind of like dig out and find some notes that I had taken when I first received this interview piece to read for a course. And so I wanted to share with you some moments that really stand out and informed kind of this interview project or works that I was able to develop as a result. And articulating worlds, and this piece that you see on the right side, it's a reference to Anna DeVere Smith's When Words Become You, an interview that she does with Carol Martin. And there's a moment in this work where Carol Martin asks Anna DeVere Smith, and you'll see it kind of with this first orange or second orange arrow, She says, sometimes we see you obliquely when someone refers to the process of being interviewed. You form this difficult material in a very emotional and human way. It must take some struggle to get to a place to make those decisions. And Anna DeVere Smith replies, my grandfather told me that if you say a word often enough, it becomes you. I was interested before I developed this project in how manipulating words has spiritual power. I can learn to know who somebody is, not from what they tell me, but from how they tell me. This makes an impression on my body and eventually my psyche. Not what I would understand it to be, but what I feel it. My goal would be to these kind of words are funny and probably in print, and they sound even worse, become possessed, so to speak, of the person. I don't set out to do anything as intellectual as what you're talking with. And it's here that Smith really gives me a language and an approach to kind of navigate these interviews that I would eventually embark on for the performance. So I began to develop this format, the performance piece, by creating a set of 10 questions that I formulated and asked to each person the first time I conducted interviews. And the questions I formed sought to explore people's memories and thoughts of Washington Park Court, as well as Bronzeville, the greater community and the block that it was situated within. At the time, I was particularly interested in identifying what it was like to live and interact with neighbors on the block versus navigating from and through Bronzeville. It was a zooming in on the in-between within the differences and similarities of a space I once shared with the interviewees that shaped the monologues I would go on to transcribe verbatim. Starting and stopping the audio recordings numerous times, I began to capture each person's diction and the tone of their voice within my transcriptions. From the first set of interviews, I was able to draft and perform 3 monologues on the stoop, a sculpture that I built to symbolize the third space. As I continued to work on this interview project, I expanded upon my interviews and in some cases re-interviewed people. For the second round of interviews, I only asked 3 questions from the original 10, and I welcomed more deviations within my interviews. Sometimes we only got through 1 question because as I listened to their response, I became more curious about what they were sharing or perhaps what I felt they were leaving out. In the first set of interviews, I felt obligated to get through the set of 10 questions that you guys just saw and to have these really long recordings and written descriptions of the spaces and the interviews that took place, or the interviews where they took place, in order to help me develop my performance. During the second set of interviews, which I began while enrolled in Rachel Cohen's Writing Lives course, I began to think about the work as a written piece, which you see here. How could third space and the stoop still be seen or perhaps felt through the transcribed text on the page, drawn memory map, and photographed imagery? So one of the things that I changed, instead of just writing 10 questions out and attempting to get through the set of 10 questions and writing out a description of the space, I cut down my question list, and I also began photographing my interviewees at the end of the interview with my 35mm film camera in the space where they sat and in the space that they sat as we engaged in a dialogue. And the written piece I developed, I would present their monologues first, which were snippets of our dialogue, which seemed to be the most concise, allowing me to stitch together a narrative arc, which addressed their movement through, away, and to the block. After the monologue, I would place the photograph almost as a surprise behind it. I wanted the viewer to craft their own vision of the person in the space first from the verbatim transcription before reckoning with the space and the subject that I framed. And so, as you see on the previous slide, it's usually a monologue text, and then I would place the photograph or one of these photographs that you see here after the monologue text to create another vision of the person in the space. And the next work that I was able to develop from the interview, I used basically, there were 2 sets of interviews, and it was the second round of interviews that I was able to form a video work entitled Some Things Never Change, Monologues from the Stoop in Bronzeville, which you can find on my Vimeo page if you want to watch that later. In this performance, I hired actors to maybe read the monologues verbatim on the stoop while incorporating their own experiences growing up and or perhaps raising Black families and navigating their communities and living spaces. In the video performance, the stoop sculpture is intended to be a grounding figure. Its architecture is what facilitates the dialogue between the actor and the text. The third space is created again as the actor is asked to examine their own identity in relation to the transcribed other, invisible but present on the page. So from 2 interviews or 2 rounds of interviews, I was basically able to create 3 bodies of work. And it's this last work that you see here that I think allowed me to connect with Stephanie. I think this was her entry point into my practice, and it's a video that would go on to play a central role in our dialogues together. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Stephanie. And she's going to share her experiences working within the third space and also some of the engagement that we've been able to create with each other.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jasmine. I think it's helpful, like Jasmine's definition of third space, because it comes from her own formulation. I have a background in political theory, so I'm going to go straight back to how I define third space, and that is through not only Homi Bhabha, but also Edward Zoja. So something that I thought was really helpful within third space is that it's usually attributed to Homi Bhabha, but it's been applied and reimagined and reapplied many times over by different theorists and practitioners in different contexts and space, which makes it really easy to adapt into my own. But I always return to his original theorization because of the way that Bhabha thinks through fixed spaces that are binary, but then applying ambivalence and hybridity as a space to imagine beyond a binary paradigm that seeks to like fix our, not only our identities, but like the spaces in which we can move. But also it like, he sees it as a space that is, it's not only like confined to engendering possibilities, but it's like an active space where it's like always a space of constant production, which aligns with my thinking because I think a lot about how do you show process and how do you create enough resources for our artists to not only develop final works, but to be in process. So thinking about third space as a space of like constant production is very helpful for my thinking and formulation as it relates to curation and programming. But it's the way that Bhabha thinks about it. It's like it's interruptive, it's interrogative, but it's like enunciative. It's when it creates new signs of identity and innovative sites of collaboration. He sees it as a metaphorical space without a fixed location. So he's thinking about it much more within discursive conditions, but that is helpful in thinking about how Shoja, like definitely building off Bhabha, but as a geographer is thinking about third space in terms of like spatiality. So he's thinking about third space as a kind of, I guess like going back, like he thinks third space, rather first space is physical forms of social spatiality. So like houses, cities, streets, a lot of like home and then where you go to work. Whereas these second spaces or like second space is thinking a lot of like the conceptualization of space. So how artists bring space into the world through like their perspectives of reality. But then he thinks of third space as a place in between both the metaphorical space and like the, I guess you could say the different perspectives that like artists or urban planners is his use of it. And like there's a space in between where socialization occurs, which I think is where me and Jazmine locate our idea of third space. And before I was thinking a lot, by before I mean prior to talking with Jazmine, I was thinking a lot about as a curator and arts administrator who's interested in institution building as a creative practice. So how can you use arts administration processes creatively to make arts institutions that care for artists and like the different images and works that they make. I was thinking through how like many artists, especially Black artists, Black emerging artists, especially after the protests this summer, were thinking through how do they engage the communities that they come from, so communities that look like them but may not feel welcome in a gallery space, while also circulating their visual works in the art world. Because a lot of what they were thinking about is that they saw it as a binary, right? So they saw it as like two fixed spaces. Either they're working in doing community work or they're circulating their art in the gallery, which in the gallery maybe isn't a very hospitable space for people that look like us. But with community work, it felt disingenuous because they hadn't been working in it prior, or they saw that people doing community work were doing it there's already people doing community work. So for them, it was two spaces and they couldn't find a place for their works to be and to live. Whereas I think that there is this third space that's hybrid in the middle. I don't think it physically exists yet, but I think that there's a lot of space for one, or like maybe even myself, to creatively imagine with institution building to make this space where artists can do this work. So I had been thinking a lot about this, and then until speaking with Jazmine and reintroducing me to third space theory, that it's given me a lot of language to shape my thinking around this. So the image you see here is a conversation that Jazmine and I had alongside Cameron Granger and Sasha Fierce-Burgess on this very question of like, where do these Black artists and the different visual archives and communities they want to engage with, where does this work exist? I think we can go to the next slide, Jazmine.
Okay. And
Okay.
I was just gonna say, just direct me, but if you need me to turn off my screen, I'm happy to toss it to you. So let me know.
Yeah, I think it's nice because I only have a couple slides, so thank you.
Okay.
I'll have you be the remote. Yeah, so I wear a lot of hats in the Chicago arts world. One of them is being the co-founder of Anna's, which is a collaborative residency program that myself and my co-founder Alden Burke created in 2018. And a lot of the work that we do is we create arts administrative processes to create a supportive space for 4 to 6 emerging makers to make work, a collaborative work, and collaborate over 6 months and make a collaborative work together. And a lot of that involves in-person meetings, not just because there's like the practical work of producing a project, but in order for 6 people who don't know one another to feel that they can trust one another with each other's ideas and thoughts and be able to kind of come together on a coherent visual language, it involves a lot of like intimate moments and a lot of space to be like, to see one another and to eat food and to make work and to go through exercises. So what you see here on the left is an image of, that's Alden Burke on the left, and then Zachary Nickel on the right, one of Anna's 2020 residents. And then on the screen is Willie Smart on the little left, and then Danielle Vickers on the little right. And they are also our 2020 residents, but Willie at that time lived in Pittsburgh, and Danielle lives in Hamilton, Montana. So that was the moment where, even before, because this image was taken in January 2020, that was when we were already trying to explore, like, can you have collaboration exist in a virtual space? And I bring that up because then we very quickly, as everyone knows, a couple of months later, we were all relegated into this virtual space. And I think at first we weren't sure if the residency would continue through the disruptive moment that was March, but we felt that it was like an emotionally healthy place to live while everything else was kind of falling apart. So a lot of the collaborative residency prior involved this process of getting to know one another through exercises. And so myself and Alden couldn't think through how do we do that work virtually in a way that still has that intimate space, that kind of like third space that's in between something that is like in process and a final product. So we thought through, especially because the Zoom grid, right, is not quite intimate. So we thought through like, let's pair the artists together and have them go through a process of interviews of their own making. So we didn't quite give them a structure. We more just paired them up and asked them to interview one another. And then the products of these interviews were more creative than something like a transcript or a recording. It was perhaps like a puppet play or a window drawing. But that was really fertile ground that led into, and I can have Jazmine go to the next slide. Yeah, so that was perfect. So that was really fertile ground because another hat that I wear is I'm a resident at Chicago Artists Coalition, and another moment of a residency that went from a physical space into a virtual space in March. And a lot of the work that Hatch does, in addition to having exhibitions that for both the 3 curators and the 12 artists, there's moments of meeting once a month to have critique, but also have these in-between spaces of having a snack and asking someone how they're doing and getting to know people in those in-between moments. So those fell away, and the artists expressed over the summer that they really desired that space, even though we were still going through the more practical work of preparing everyone's exhibitions. So alongside Fabiola Tosi and Joelle Daly, who are also Chicago Artists Coalition Hatch curators, we created an artist interview scaffolding so that the artist could do the work of being able to have professional development, to talk about their practice and process with another creative mind, but also have that kind of human scale, like internal programming that we didn't get with those, once those monthly meetings fell away because we couldn't meet in person. So we paired, there's 12 artists, we made 6 pairs, and we did those pairs based off, some pairs were paired because of their artistic practice. There seemed like there was really beautiful conversation, either conceptually or materially. And then other pairs, we were honestly just matchmaking and thought their personalities would generate like really beautiful interviews. Yeah, so the interview process was, we gave them a structure so that they could fill in the gaps in between, so they would have like bumpers. So it wasn't just free flowing and they could do whatever, but also it wasn't really highly prescribed from the start. But it was more framed in that we wanted certain deliverables and that we wanted certain interviews to occur. So we wanted like an archival record, whether that was a textual transcript or a video recording or a sound recording. And then we wanted ephemera, like any ephemera that might emerge, of which this is one. This is a letter that was written to Jazmine from her pair, partner Joshi Raiden. And then we also wanted them to reflect on the interview process that they had over the course of 4 months, and then create an artistic rendering, which that's the process that the group is in right now. So this started in October of 2020 and it's still ongoing. And then the interview works will be in tandem with the Artist Coalition's survey show, which will be in March. The survey show will be all 12 artists on view at CAC, curated by myself and Fabiola and Joelle. So yeah, we asked them for these 3 deliverables, but how they structured their interviews was more contingent on what made sense for not only their practice, but also like how comfortable maybe they felt being in person with another person, like letting them set their own boundaries for that. And across all pairs, the interview processes really ranged. Some remained in the virtual space and remained on Zoom, but that still allowed the human scale one-on-one internal programming that we intended for. I know that Jazmine and Joshi, they went on some walks outside, but then also used letters as a way to have an interview process. So exchanging letters back and forth. And then, and on, there's different kinds of forms of interview process, whether it was texting or exchange of hair is one of, I would argue that is an interview process as a dialogue space. So yeah, so I think that this process was successful in that it did the work that we wanted it to do. It created connection across space and time when in-person gathering can't happen and people are feeling really isolated, and the feedback was more often than not that the pairs felt that they made a connection. I know like one pair has plans in the spring to go roller skating together and they didn't know each other prior. So the interviewing space is not only a space to discuss practice and share it with the public, but also interviewing space as a way to, as cheesy it may sound, to make friendship is something that is pretty important to like my practice personally. Yeah, and something that I'll conclude with before I go back to Jazmine is that as an arts administrator, as a curator, I think before in the summer, arts institutions have used virtual programming as a way to translate what originally occurred in space, whether it was in galleries or museums, but virtual programming I think is going to be here to stay for quite some time, which I'm excited about. I think that it's not only accessible, like it allows much more kinds of publics into a space maybe they didn't feel comfortable with, but I think there's a lot of new terrain to cover in terms of virtual programming. But I think that before the virtual programming space, or rather it's still occurring, it's just a translation of programming that occurred in museums. So a panel is now a 4-person grid on Zoom, but I'm personally like very invested in thinking through like what are virtual third spaces that already exist, so that are informal and generative and accessible, and how do you bring that into arts virtual programming. And I think there's one more slide that I'm kind of curious about, because this next slide is Jazmine's
Yeah.
experience doing the Chicago Artists Coalition interview process. So if you don't mind, Jazmine, I kind of want to hear more from you about what it was like to do that interview that myself and Fabiola and Joelle set up for you guys.
Yeah, I think what was really special about it is that first I was really excited and wanted to be paired with Joshi, but it kind of gave us some nice parameters in order to be able to create objects around. And I think the fact that it was set up in a way where we were asked to engage in like dialogue with another artist and to create questions to kind of shape this process was really nice. So I really appreciated that the curators gave us some aspects of structure, but a lot of freedom to kind of imagine the final result. And so I don't know about you guys, but I hadn't really like wrote too many things or mailed too many things prior to this exchange that I did with Joshi. And it was really nice to think about how maybe dialogue again could exist through text and questioning that we came up with for each other. So I'm gonna go to the next slide if that's okay with you, Stephanie. And these are two of the final renderings I came up with from the project that I did with Joshi. And so I have, I think in total we exchanged about 12 items. And what we chose to do is there were a series of questions that we came up with that of course we shared online. But with each letter, we chose to include some aspects of our identity or our work. And so I wanted to kind of create a grid that kind of replicated, you know, an archive or a list of things that were gathered. And so some of the things that, you know, we exchanged were things we had created or perhaps received, but all of the different narratives that we were able to kind of write out to better understand our own practice and our own past and how they informed how we were thinking about making now became these really symbolic things that we could give to each other. And so I was super appreciative of the opportunity that Stephanie, Fabiola, and sorry, I am blanking, but Stephanie, Fabiola,
Joelle.
and Joelle. I'm so sorry, Joelle. I'm a little nervous right now, so charge my brain. We're able to create for us to be able to experience. And so I don't know maybe how you guys kind of received or were able to kind of what your experience was viewing some of the submissions that the artists created, but I know that it was a really rewarding process to be able to engage in during a period of so much uncertainty. And sorry again, Joelle, I am really sorry.
It's okay, it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I could speak to receiving, because I think that as also an arts writer in Chicago, I'm used to a certain process of interview, both the research that goes in an interview, how it's conducted, how it's recorded, and then how it's shared out to a public. Usually it follows, it doesn't always, but in the arts writing world, it usually follows a kind of flow. It has similar questions about practice and about dissemination. So it was really rewarding to see the different versions of the artist interviews, and you and Joshi employed both letter writing and object making, but there's been other versions where it's been either like songwriting, recipe making, and the ways that you're able to translate interview into objects that are reflective of each practice, and also like the ways that you guys were generous with the process, but also with each other was really like honestly really beautiful to see. And I know that me and Joelle and Fabiola, after you guys had shared out the different objects and processes that you guys had. We had like a moment with like, I don't know, just like a little teary, very excited, feeling very warm. Because it also, and the thing that interviews is that usually they stop, or not usually, but sometimes within practice, interviews or a conversation happen over decades. But for the most part, like you have the interview, it concludes and then it's written and shared. But to see that these different interviews across pairs is now generating into dialogue that's going to like come up with through relationship is very rewarding to see. Because I don't know if that was initially an intention, but I think that's an intention of the Hatch program, right? And that was something that we weren't able to have due to the circumstances around our living. So being able to see that we could create a platform for that still to exist in spite of and through interview is really amazing. So thank you guys for the generous offerings that you gave us.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to conclude the presentation, but I'm happy to, during the question period, to go back to any particular slides that may pertain to the question that's being asked. So I'll stop sharing. And thank you guys for listening.
Thank you, everyone.
So much for that presentation. I loved that last slide. It was so beautiful. I guess we can open it up to questions from everybody. So yeah, go ahead. Oh, and if you have like, you can message me on the chat and I'll stack you guys' questions in case, you know. Rachel, go ahead.
Go ahead with Brianna.
Okay, Brianna, you can ask your question.
She typed it in the chat. So the question was, how did you recruit participants? Do you mean for
just for, you guys kind of did this pairing and getting everybody's artwork, and so yeah, just how you went through that process, I guess.
Yeah, so Brianna, you're speaking specifically to the grid and the letters that were exchanged.
Yes.
So are you interested in a question of how were the 12 participants selected, or how did we create the pairs?
Both, but I was thinking more about the participants, how you kind of picked the 12, like or found the people.
So myself and Jazmine are part of a residency program that is out of Chicago Artists Coalition. It's called Hatch Residency. So there are 3 curatorial residents. They're actually here in the meeting as well, Fabiola Tosi and Joelle Daly, and myself are the 3 curators. And then there are 12 artist residents, of which there's Jazmine. I could go through the other 11. There's a few also here in this room. I see Jose Perez, and I also see Julia Klein. So the 12 artists it's a jury, so they're picked and then they're entered into a residency program. The residency is usually within a usual year. It's they have 2 exhibitions, so they have their duo exhibition and then they also have their survey show, which just has 12 artists in it, all 12 artists, and then it's curated by the 3 of us. But then alongside of that, we have like our monthly Hatch meetings where we go through and we critique people's works. But yeah, so those didn't occur. So myself and Fabiola and Joelle, we created an interview process to kind of replicate the Hatch meetings that we would have. So how do we create like a group gathering in the virtual space that isn't just 12 people in a grid, but then also how do we recreate that human scale one-on-one interaction that happens like when we take breaks. So we thought of the interview process, and then through the 12 artists, their artistic practices range across like photo, painting, sculpture, new media, performance. So that's pretty wide ranging, and also ranging across historical scope and materials. So myself, Fabiola, and Joelle, we each in the program kind of care for and curate 4 artists. So we each have 4 artists throughout the program that we work into 2 exhibitions. So we already have pretty intimate knowledge of the ways that they work, but also the ways that they are as people, their personalities. So we went through a process of thinking through how can we pair these people together, and through also, I'll speak to myself, through my knowledge as being a co-founder of Anna's, which is a residency program focused on process. It's that process of selecting artists to be in the residency is a lot about their material and artistic concerns as it is about their personalities. So thinking about what is important perhaps to creating like a really beautiful interview, but also the process of making an interview. I think that there is overlap between conceptual concerns so that they can have a kind of common language between them. And I think that really occurred with one pair, Ellen Holtzblatt and Celine Moore. They're both painters, but I also would say they're both painters that not only do representational painting, but are very much invested in material and making their own oil, making their own paint, thinking through different papers. So like the ways that they can honestly like nerd out over that, and then just create a lot of space for them to like exchange resources. And I think it was a really great space for them. Whereas like with Jazmine and Joshi Radin, they both have a very strong photography background, but have recently moved into print. So the way that they are both going along this trajectory, we thought there would be not only a great space to interview, but also a great space for them to reflect together about this journey, about why moving through a photographic process to a print process, and what does that mean for them individually, and how can they learn from one another. And I could go on and on and on. So those are kind of the considerations that went into developing these pairs.
Thank you.
Rachel, I think you can go ahead.
Okay. Jazmine and Stephanie, thank you so much. Stephanie, it's such a pleasure to have a chance to meet you in this, although, virtually. And I've been reading your work and really admiring it. So it's very nice to, get to hear you and kind of learn more about these different projects. I was interested in something that you were saying about the sort of situation of an artist who is on the one hand responsible to a gallery that's not that receptive, and on the other hand trying to figure out a relationship to a community that maybe isn't that comfortable in the gallery setting. That kind of in between situation, that seemed really helpful, the way that you articulated that. And Jazmine, and so sort of for both of you, I was kind of curious about the difference between being an interviewer, like where you were in the situation of interviewing people, and being mutually interviewing with 2 artists. Like that seemed like an interesting kind of shift in, and in the interviews that you were doing when, as we've been working together, I wonder, Jazmine, how much you think of those interviews as mutual events, and how how you think about the directionality of the interview, because I think a lot of mutuality comes through in your work, and I think that's an interesting aspect of it. So if you both would like to talk about that, that would be great.
I'll get started. So I think in both cases, I don't think I've ever just interviewed someone who I did not know prior to and create work from it. There's, I would definitely say with the Washington Park Court and the monologues on the stoop in Bronzeville, because I spent, I would say about 23 years of my life on this block, there was a familiarity with the people that I was engaging with. And so I think when I first approached them to do interviews, it was definitely, I don't know, I think I was being a little too rigid with myself in terms of like my engagement. It was like, I need to get through this set of 10 questions, and like, I want to be professional. And I think by the time we continued talking and I came back around and did them again, and they were gracious enough to like give me their time, it became really more so of a dialogue. And so it was less of like, let me let me get through this list, and more of like, okay, I have these questions, but if we hit them, great. If we go off on this random tangent, then like I'm for it and I can create something from that piece. And so I felt like it was, in terms of like the structure and how I was presenting myself, it felt a little bit more horizontal in terms of a collective engagement that was very back and forth. And when we think about third space, I think the second round of interviews probably would fit more into that realm. I would say with the interviews that I was able to do through the Chicago Artists Coalition with Joshi, we had met each other, but I will say I was super excited to be paired with Joshi just because I don't want to get too woo, but just sometimes you meet people and you feel like you don't have to put on anything. Like you can just show up and be your weird, awkward self. And I think Joshi allowed for that space, or at least that's the energy I felt from the time that I met her. So having the opportunity to like slow down and actually write each other was really great. I think we're both maybe in some ways a little introverted. And so I think through the text writing, we were able to be even more descriptive. And I think again, like the conversations have always been easy with Joshi from the time we met, even at plein air or took walks. But it was really their writing that I think allowed us maybe something sort of thinking within the intimate. So I think, again, the structure felt a little bit flat through the letter dialogue. And I think it also took a lot of pressure off of us to fill kind of the space with air or like language that maybe is a little bit harder for us to kind of do on the spot from time to time. And so I think, I don't know, it just felt really personal to be able to give people things that I haven't shared with anybody else, and same for Joshi. So I hope that answers the question, but I'm curious to hear maybe, I don't know if Stephanie has anything to share, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also mindful of, I could definitely answer that question, but I think I iterate what Jazmine shared, and I know there's a couple other people that have raised their hand, so I might offer it up to another questioner.
I'm gonna read a question from the chat from Carol, and then we have Matthew and then Kelly. So Carol asks, third spaces can be different dimensions. Jazmine, how do you find, examine, and promote different artistry in third spaces?
Yeah, so this is something that I think came up really nice in the longer interview that Stephanie and I did with each other maybe about a week ago. But I think I was thinking about, you know, the stoop for so long has played like a central role in how I'm thinking about third space and really trying to think about it architecturally. So like, how can I bring, you see in these photographs, you know, people in their homes, but like, how can I bring all of these people together and really acknowledge the fact that we did share a space, and how can I ground it in something that is physical? And I think this sculpted stoop that I created allowed me to do that. And it allowed for a direct connection between each of the characters. So in the video, which you can watch at a later time, again on Vimeo, you see kind of each of the characters reading these monologues, but, you know, they get up and there's, you know, they get up, they come to the stoop, they read, they leave. And it's this interchange around the central subject. And so I think I'm thinking about, I've been thinking about lately how third spaces maybe aren't as physical. So what happens, you know, we live in this space where we can't connect. So I've been thinking about, like, can a person be a third space? You know, can, what are some other things? Can third spaces be temporal? So do they need is a physical object necessary to kind of allow the dialogue to take place? I in our conversations, me and Stephanie have played around with using Zoom backgrounds as a way to create a third space within our Zoom calls. So like I've placed myself again in the middle of a double Dutch rope with like Margaret Burroughs in the background. And I think it's like, I'm thinking about that moment when I took this photograph and some of the conversations that I was having with my friends, or even that random little Black girl who walked up and wanted to join us and like double dutching. Like that's a third space moment that is very temporal. It is not necessarily a physical object, but maybe it was an activity that allowed us to connect. In the case of Zoom, I would say, our backgrounds, and we're both on the same thing. Before this call started, Stephanie was like, you know what, she came on with the beauty salon in the background, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. It doesn't get more third space than that. And so I think third space in conversation is probably just a space where I think people can be vulnerable. Like I want to think of it as like a safe space of some aspects of exchange. So I don't know, maybe it's many things, but I also think there's a filling. So if we were having this conversation and it felt very cold, I don't know if I would consider it a third space between Stephanie and I, but I do think it's the warmth and the care and the questions and the listening that maybe start to kind of facilitate that temporal space.
Matthew?
Hey, thanks. My internet's always weird, so that was super interesting. And actually what you just said was where my question was, is that, it's a hypothesis that I have, that most of the important art isn't objects over the last 50 years. It's probably other stuff, and we just don't have categories for other stuff. So third space is other stuff in my way of understanding it. Mm-hmm. And then, so what is the space for other stuff? And then the next question is, and this is the one that's really crucial to me, which I was getting a lot of different vibes from you both, which is, to what extent does it need to be public? Does it need to be shared with a public? And to what extent can it be allowed to remain intimate in something that is important for one person, two people, where does that play out? And there's a great Theaster quote in the Times the other day about he wants to make his art in darkness, away from the light. And that kind of relates to that question as well. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And to speak to the first one of like, that is very much your question of like, where is this other space where these things live? I mean, that is, I would say, like the main thrust of like my creative practice as it relates to institution building. And I'm going to be honest in that to say that I don't know, but I also would say that I think a lot of people don't know either. That one slide that I presented where it was a conversation between myself, Jazmine, Cameron Granger, and Sasha Pierre-Burgess, it was a lot of us being okay with not knowing, but intimating like, what are the things that we would need in this space to exist? And a lot of it was the note that Rachel brought up earlier about like mutuality. There needs to be kind of like a mutual, not only in that sense of like mutual respect and care, but a mutual like recognition of the other person in that space. And then to your second point, Matthew, about like, does this work need to be in public? I would say for myself in particular, like I am very much invested in creating intimate spaces, which is something I mentioned before with like my creation of Anna's, which is very much about creating like spaces for artists to be okay about being in process and to be more focused on that space than really investing their resources in like the public presentation. So, and I think that is something that for Jazmine's interviews that myself and Fabiola and Joelle created, was that we shared from the outset with the 12 artists that we weren't necessarily concerned with like the public presentation of these interviews. It was very much about using these interviews as a way for them to get to know one another, to create that intimate space, more human scale internal programming than for it to be, okay guys, we need you to create this interview because it's going to be shared on this arts writing platform, or it's going to be transformed the exhibition space. Like we said from the outset that we wanted the interviews to be with just between them, and then they can share moments with the other 15 of us in the space about what they experienced and what they gleaned from it, but really the interviews were for them than for anyone else. And that kind of intimacy was pretty important to that part of the project.
Kelly?
Hey, yeah, thanks for your presentations. Yeah, I was thinking about boundaries, and I know that you're talking about like this in-between space and this third space, but also, you're mapping out what a third space means to you and means to your collaborators in any number of different ways. And in that mapping out, like figuring out what the boundaries are is a productive exercise. Like some things are in and some things are out, like what you were saying, Jazmine, in terms of like this kind of temperature, like social temperature, maybe being a boundary about like what is third space for you and what is not third space. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering kind of about what are the boundaries that came up in the negotiations that you had with yourself and with the project, attempting to figure out where the boundaries were for you and your collaborators. I'm thinking specifically, Jazmine, with you creating these monologues, like, was there ever a moment where you were like, this material is fair game and this material isn't, or like, this is someone else's narrative that I can also embody, and this is someone else's narrative that I cannot. And then, with this project with the Chicago Artists Coalition, when is it an interview and when is it a gift, or when is it a relationship, or when is it mail art? Like, I feel like all those things have very different formal considerations and forms of documentation, even though I do understand you're trying to get to, right, like a more complex world where these like structured things maybe don't exist as much. But yeah, so boundaries.
Yeah, I think that is a really helpful way, a really helpful language use, like the use of boundaries. Like I think I first shared the word, maybe it wasn't like boundaries, but like bumpers of like boundaries as outcomes and deliverables. So like the boundary for what you share with the group after this process is done is archival transcript, it's ephemera, and it's kind of like an artistic rendering. And that is like the boundary. But in terms of like negotiating what like interpersonal boundaries may be, intentionally left to the two people that would be both creating and mediating that process. That like we can't determine what your boundaries are as they may relate to meeting in person during a pandemic, or what makes sense in terms of your very specific material practice and what resources are available to you. So you being the kind of the agent, determine what those boundaries are for yourself, as long as you have like these 3 deliverables, whatever that means for you in terms of like personally and professionally, like resource wise, that is the boundary that's set. But then I think you bring up a really good question of like, I love to play with language and play with like the contours of language. So like in my mind, like the exchange of those letters are interviews. It may not look the same way of like being in time with one another, being in the same space as one another, like that exchange of an interview, but I would like to expand the idea of interview to include those objects, to include those ephemera. But I think you're right that in terms of like documentation, like caring for these very specific discrete objects, that perhaps playing with that language and letting those boundaries doesn't do the work of, because like interviews and objects and ephemera all necessitate different kind of care. So blurring those boundaries allows like different like ideas and possibilities to imagine, but when you blur those boundaries between form, then how you like the workflow, like the actual workflow also becomes muddy, and how you get from the beginning to the end, and maybe you lose things in between. Whereas like interviews as we know them, they have a process for a reason and they have a workflow for a reason. It gives in some ways like a very important sense of care to like the person in the final project, which we started noticing within this, like myself, I think I started noticing more is that we were missing really beautiful objects because we hadn't set up a process for taking care of these items. So I think messing with boundaries was fun, but then you do lose things, and how do you take care of those things in the process, I think is something that if I was going to do this again, I would be more attentive to.
And I would say I second what Stephanie was saying in regards to the output maybe being the boundary parameters. In terms of like the interviews, there were times where I always ask, like, can I take a photo of you? I think I showed one interview that had been transcribed into a monologue by Shaylin, and she did not want her photo taken at that moment. And so I think that's a very obvious or direct boundary, but I think for me it was like the output or kind of like the final end product that created the boundaries for me. I also think there's a sensitivity. I think that is maybe very personal to me, and I think if it were something that were said, that I would kind of question, like, okay, if I said this and I feel comfortable putting it out there, I'm definitely one to probably like ask the person that I'm engaging with this dialogue with if I could share it. In most cases, I don't know. I think it's filling it out in conversation, but I don't know. I guess like beyond just asking, can I share this or can I do this? I didn't really feel the need to kind of like focus too much on maybe what the limitations were within the dialogue that I was seeking to engage with and create from. But
we have a question from Jofi, who asks, I also really love the images you shared at the end, and I'm wondering if you could talk about objects and images as catalysts of conversations versus as outcomes of conversations, or maybe even the circularity of that relationship.
sorry, can you repeat that one more time? Sorry.
If you could talk about objects and images as catalysts of conversations versus as outcomes of conversations, or the relationship between those two things.
Versus as outputs of conversation as catalysts. I would say that I think if anything, maybe the second image is reflective of some of the outputs of conversations, but I think maybe the actual letter writing that you see on the left of the image, or what I'm looking at right now, is probably more of the catalyst. I think it's the ongoing nature of the letter writing, and so in some cases the letters even that follow, there is an output, but it also informs maybe future letters that were perhaps written. I also think seeing them in relationship to each other creates a whole new dialogue in a way, or it can be seen as a catalyst for like engagement in a way that if maybe I would have just like, I don't know, scanned them and showed them individually would not exist. And so I think it's maybe the placement of the objects next to each other that can initiate something more. And also seeing the run-ons and the incompleteness of it, also how I show the letters. So not, in some cases you don't see all of the letter, but you see a portion of it. And so they're kind of flowing into each other really beautifully, or there seems to be perhaps some interactions that aren't just present in the language that is directly written on them. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. I think it's also, because I know we're getting close to end of time, so I won't go too long, but I think for me it's helpful to, instead of think of catalysts as like maybe like prompts, and I think that when using object as prompts and as a kind of editor of these interviews and hearing about the different pairs and how they move through these spaces, how the different objects they made both like served as a prompt to go into the next question. So it maybe was a flow of like question asked, then object made, which prompted the next question or next answer, and flowed in that way. And in that way, the objects not only were themselves like prompts or catalysts, but were also, I would say, like in a way of like non-being agency, we're also like participant in the conversation. I would say like, I think that's most apparent with it, like pairing that exchanged hair as a way to have like an interview process, and the way that those objects, I would say in those interviews, were very much like participate in the conversation and not just like catalysts that these like humans like jumped off of and to get into a conversation.
I really like this, that both of the things that you said, I think really get at how much both of you kind of think about institutions and spaces as made up of people and their relationships between them, rather than as just like abstract configurations of things. And I'm wondering about how that relates to interviewing as a way of, it's like a half formed question, but maybe the interview as a way of understanding the practices of those institutions and spaces as like a sort of feedback mechanism, I guess, for that like relational aspect. I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well, but like the interview is a sort of as a way of checking in about whether the institution or the space is working the way that in a way that facilitates third space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is like a very exciting question for me, because Anna's is about to embark on a project. My independent art space is about to embark on a project in tandem with the Luminary in St. Louis, where we're thinking through how institutions have not evoked care. And like, I mean like care, not in like a way of like the language that's employed as a kind of like signaling, like virtue signaling, but like I mean like actual care as it relates to like human resources and labor and salaries. And so one of the things that we'll be doing at the Luminary is performing as like care consultants, and part of that work is interviewing the people who come into contact with this institution. And thinking through interviewing as a way to like provide feedback as we do this like audit of an arts institution. How do you also make those interviews with the different employees, but also artists and different like preparators, art handlers that come into the space and use interview as feedback, but then also how do you use that interview as a way to make that process visible? Because sometimes it's, I think those interviews like evoke a lot of trust and care, and necessarily like relegating them to a public space as process isn't the best way to like keep that trust going forward. So then kind of going back to like the question Matthew brought up of like, does it need to be public? I would say those interviews perhaps at first glance don't. So for me, I think interview as a place to like inform a maybe more like analytical audit of an institution and how it invokes care to the people that come in contact is actually like my main 2021 project. So I could talk about this for a really long time. But I think having the first person perspective alongside like a perhaps like data analysis of an institution is like, I think the qualitative and the quantitative like need to come into play. And I think there's a lot of things I'm thinking about with interview, like now you're making my head dizzy because I'm like very excited. But I think that is one of like the main methods that we're going to be employing.
I think this goes so well with Kelly's work. It's kind of like the flip side of Kelly's work, which is so cool. Rachel, do you have a question?
Yeah, we go till 12:30, right? Or is that so there's great. A thing that I was thinking about a little bit is the kind of intersection with visual art, or so the kind of it was the thing that I really noticed in reading, Jazmine, the different stages of your work, that like every time something came before me that was the result of an interview, it had this like extra beautiful spatiality or something, like the way that the words were configured on the page, the lineation, like the poetic lineation of the interview. But also you and I have talked about like just how much time you spent figuring out the punctuation that you wanted for certain pauses, and like rendering the, is this an ellipsis or a dash? Is this like, how many ends do I need to get the sound of it? And that kind of hypercare of the transcription seems to me to have like a very visual effect on me. Like when I'm reading it, I feel the kind of space of the person's voice in some way. It's like the way that you hear them and then don't hear them, the kinds of pauses that are in the voice. And so that, I mean, that just seems like particular to your talent, that that's something that you are really able to render. But then it's very useful for us to be thinking about in terms of how interviews are conducted and transcribed, like what the visual sort of potentiality is of it. Like, and I felt that in the kind of notebook entry that you show that I felt grateful to have in the notebook that I keep online generally, that this space of it, the visual space, and the evocation of the visual by having your drawing and then your photographs kind of like makes the reader sensitive to the visual aspects of the interview. And I think that's something for all of us to think about, because in interviewing artists, there's this great possibility of kind of working between text and image, for lack of better, and to actually get to talk to working artists. I felt this talking with Kelly too, is just very helpful. So if you could just say a little bit about those visual aspects, that would be great.
Yeah, I think particularly with the written piece that we've discussed quite a bit is I think it's figuring out how to like position things and also how to like share things within a space. And I think in most transcriptions, you usually see like this paragraph form of this, you know, there's a question asked and then like a paragraph of text. And I don't know, I'd like to think about the conversations I have with people. I mean, usually I'm pretty interested in them, but I also think of them as being really sacred and just appreciative of people's willingness to engage with me. And so I think in the transcription of them, there's a part of me that really wants to honor how they said things and make sure that when the viewer is reading the text on the page or even listening to maybe the performance piece, I guess just to go back, I mentioned earlier, like, can a person be a third space? And in some ways, in this case, I would kind of think of myself as a third space or this intermediary, being able to facilitate, like, how can I bring, I don't know, Rachel's voice into the viewer's mind without Rachel necessarily being there. So yes, I've transcribed it, but I don't want it to feel like this very cold piece of text. And so I think organizing it in a spatial way where it appears to look like it's somewhat poetic, I think I don't know, I feel like poetry creates some aspects of like intimacy and that requires the viewer or the reader to slow down and like read it and sit with it and think about how it's being presented. I also think I'm really interested in how we as viewers or readers sometimes craft images of people. And so I think, or spaces based upon the text that's being presented in front of us. And so really thinking about the placement, like, I mean, I feel like it kind of kills the vibe or any type of mystery by placing the photograph before the text. Like, I'm really interested in people being able to be heard and not necessarily judged for like their living spaces or how they look. And so I care a lot about what the person is saying. And I think I want the text to kind of reflect that level of care and like sensitivity to the interviewee. I also think the way I set things up, like doing this memory map of a neighborhood, you know, I'm not looking to make a Picasso like, you know, drawing, but really just thinking on a very elementary scale, like how can I do this act of like drawing really quickly think about objects within space and also start to kind of bring the reader into the work by having these little small anecdotes about the places. So it's not just drawing the objects, but it's like, oh, this is Miss Lacey's lot that we couldn't play on. Like there's these little tidbits that are shared early on to create a communal vibe that then is kind of further put on display and shared through the text. That really requires people to slow down, because through the typing of the full enunciations, like it doesn't read very like easily like a standard interview would. And I would even someone who's really inspired me in terms of thinking about language and from a cultural perspective is especially like Zora Neale Hurston, and how she like writes in a vernacular that is very like specific to the region and the place in which she came from. And I want, even though I may be presenting this text in an academic setting, I think it's also important to honor these people's the way they speak, and I think it's just as valid in those environments. And so there's a lot of things that I'm thinking through when I created and spatially place things in specific orders, but it really is to just make sure that, Rachel, even if you aren't there to share this, like you are actually there on the page.
Maggie and then Lucia.
Thank you guys both for your beautiful presentations. I just have been thinking about this idea of interviews as intimacy throughout this conversation. And I guess I just like, Jazmine, when you were talking about the first round of interviews you did and like your kind of like adherence to this really intense, rigorous structure, and then how you kind of like redid them in the second round, I'm wondering about the relationship between intimacy, especially knowing that these were people you already knew and had relationships with potentially for like many years, like intimacy and informality or something. And I guess I'm also thinking about this word bumper that Stephanie used that I really liked, and just like how to like create intimacy in an interview, and if you think some of the like structure but also like formality was inhibiting, or if it still enabled something. Yeah, I don't know, just like maybe a little bit more reflection on this like redo, because I really am interested in that.
I think intimacy can be created in dialogue when there is a genuine sense of curiosity about what the person is saying. I think oftentimes maybe we like ask things from people because we have this expectation or this final outcome that we want to be able to achieve, whether that's gathering a knowledge so that we can work on something or work on our own stuff. But I think the second time, and I think that was the case with the 10 questions. It was, like, I need to create this work. Like, let me make sure that I am, I'm in this course, and like, let me make sure that I'm asking these questions so I have what I need to, kind of formulate these things into this final product. But I think when I approached it the second time, I think there was a genuine care and really understanding what they were saying. So I think maybe the first time I had a specific outcome that I imagined, like, I'm asking them all these spatial questions, and in some ways I felt like it was a little too academic for, not that they weren't capable of comprehending them, but just like, it just felt a little bit more forced. Like I was trying to create a narrative instead of being open to what the process, and actually like listening to what they were saying and asking more questions about that, being kind of surprised about the outcome. So I think that's the biggest thing is the care for the actual individual, and maybe being okay with not knowing kind of where the dialogue will take you, but being able to trust yourself enough that like you can formulate it into this final academic thing as needed, or perhaps even go back and ask the interviewee more information. And so I think letting go of what it needed to be, and more so just being able to sit with them and delve a little bit deeper was an opportunity to create space. And so I guess maybe that's like listening and really challenging ourselves to listen very closely to what people are saying and what that might say about them. And I think that is a way that we can create intimacy within dialogue, and that feels really authentic and genuine when it shows up at the end.
Yeah, and I'll also speak to my use of bumper language, because I think about a lot of part of my practice is thinking about how to create intimate spaces for creative production through arts administration practices. And I think a lot of creating spaces that feel intimate, that feel close, like mentally, emotionally, spiritually, for creative practitioners is that, and I'm thinking more of like in terms of like production than perhaps like a dialogic space, but a lot of that I think is creating like a stable platform for them to jump off of, so it feels secure. I think if you send one off into a space, like being able just to free float, it can be hard to see another person and not just think about, oh, what do I need to do? How do I get myself together? If you have that kind of stable platform, which I think of as like bumpers, I think of as like different kinds of like administration like practices, like timeline, schedule, et cetera, et cetera. I think that allows a kind of intimacy, especially in these times. But then it's also like time. It doesn't occur instantly. I mean, maybe this is an intimate space. I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet, but I think we've only been together as a group for a little over an hour. And I think that those kind of intimate spaces for a dialogue, they take much, much longer. So part of the work that we did in creating those hatch interviews is that it was across time, so that they can spend time getting to know one another, and so that they do have that mutuality, and they can see that I see you, you see me, and that they get to that common language. So I think it's like creating like a stable bumper or structure, so that can, I think those shapes and forms can be a lot of different things. And I also think that they are individually made. I don't think one exists and then it works all the time, or I think even between a pair, it needs to be constantly evaluated and remade, which is kind of can be exhaustive emotional labor for the person who's creating them. But yes, like a stable structure that is rebuilt and remade, but then also time, I think, in terms to make those intimate spaces for production or for dialogue.
We're nearing the end of time, but I would love to take the last question from Joelle as well.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful event. Can folks hear me? My internet is kind of, the bandwidth is pretty bad. I was just gonna, I feel like Fabiola, I'm sorry, Stephanie, I'm having name issues too. Fabiola, I feel like Stephanie kind of just responded to the question in her last comment, but I wanted to just put out there this notion of creating intimacy and sort of the struggle with then, how do you work with artists who prefer to work in isolation and don't particularly enjoy intimacy or collaborative work? How do you not force people to be open and vulnerable if they guard their vulnerability very close to them? And that's my question. And I'm asking that question to myself as well, right? Like, how do you navigate artists who may not want to make themselves vulnerable and open, and how to respect that? Yeah, and how do we respect that? And so anyone can respond to this. It's not even a question specific to Jazmine. And Jazmine, you can too. Like, feeling somehow that you're being pried open in a way that you don't want to be, especially once the information is shared outside of the pair. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I think yeah, I guess like I don't know. I guess it's just kind of respecting that. Like I had no problem. I guess the break it down to simplest terms, it just I see that as an opportunity to say like, okay, hey, you like vanilla ice cream, I like chocolate. There's some differences, and we're not able to move forward with the type of conversation. And I tend to I try to engage people with what they're willing to offer and be appreciative just for that. There was something that Stephanie mentioned earlier when she was talking about boundaries and kind of these bumpers. And I do want to say that sometimes like sharing time limits with people goes a long way. So one thing I didn't necessarily mention was like, yeah, I didn't answer like 10 or, provide 10 questions to the interviewee, but I did say like, okay, I just want to speak to you for like 45 minutes. And so like time, I think, became a way to kind of like facilitate that and also perhaps prepare the interviewee for what was going to happen. But yeah, I'm gonna just kind of end it on that note. And if anybody else wants to share their thoughts about gathering information from artists who don't want to talk that much, I guess they can share that.
We do have a comment from Lucia, so I think we have just enough time for four. So go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. Sorry, I joined probably 5 minutes late, so I'm probably missed the very beginning. But to go back to the third space, I was thinking if the space of the enunciation, the process of actually interviewing, is the real third space in itself, precisely because it's intimate, relational, temporal, and escape fixity in a way. And it goes in a way opposite to the attempt of sometimes of making a work, which trying to fix things, So in a way, the afterlife of the interview has many lives, and it can become like an artwork. And the issue I have is, do you see actually the process of the interview itself as the artwork? And if it's that, can we actually try to escape fixity and trying to, in a way, allow that space to be continued? Or is the process itself of keeping interviewing people that create that third space open? So there is many too many questions, but it's just a reflection, because it seems that on one hand your process incredible, so creative, so imaginative of making these interviews and using objects in as a kind of devices or situation or anything you have to create that third space, which is the space of the encounter and the speaking. And then there is this space afterwards, in a way that they're trying to open up other possibility. So it's in between a comment and a question, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I understand, one of like the many generous and generative questions that you offered was thinking about the life of an artwork or life of a conversation being a kind of like the binary that we kind of spoke to before, that's either it's in process or it's publicly disseminated in final. And I think that for like myself personally, even though I'm like, I would identify as a curator that promotes and circulates final objects in a gallery, I myself am thinking through the questions of like, how do you exhibit the unexhibitable? Like, how do you show process in a way that's not just text, like a transcript of an interview on a wall? Or how do you show, how do you show process is the simplest question. And I myself don't have the answer that feels genuine and speaks to the feeling that's created during the process. But I think that it's an important aspect. I think there's a lot of reasons why it's important to be able to share process in a way that invokes that curiosity that Jazmine shared, or evokes questions so that it's in itself, the viewers that come into the gallery like feel like participant, or those that come into an interview and be able to watch it also feel like they can contribute like to the process, even though they might be in different physical spaces. And there's a lot of other reasons why I feel like in process should be in invisible view and should be exhibitable, and not just relegated to final objects, but that will be a tangent. But I think there's something, I mean, I'm not gonna have Julia Klein speak, but I think Julia Klein, who's a member of this room, but also a hatch artist, like her sculptural practice, the way that she invokes a kind of in-process making of a sculpture, the way that the sculptures that she creates with like caster and cement and wire, how they have a whole life of like sometimes like 10 years, and Julia can correct me if I'm speaking incorrectly about your practice, but the way that she breaks down the sculptures and then rebuilds them. And then there's a moment where they come into the gallery space as a final object, but then they're taken back into the studio and they're broken down and remade into another. And the way that the encounter is really important. Like I think there's the encounter in the studio with Julia's work, but I would say like that in process is just as much part of like that creative life as it is like being in a studio. Whereas I think some artists go from the method of, I have a piece of paper, I'm drawing, it's in process, it's going on the wall, and then it's archived or it's sold. But the way that this very specific maker, Julia, takes her sculptures in like the in-process moment, like the lack of fixity in terms of like, this is a studio space and this is a gallery like presentation, the way that it flows in between, I think is really generative. And I think I'm still learning a lot about those processes. I'm kind of rambling now because I'm like thinking through the question that you're saying because it's so rich, and I'm thinking, but I think it's basically the question of like, how do you show in process work in a way that makes it really apparent that it's not just the after like residue, but it's in process and it feels, and not just a performative work. I don't know, Jazmine, if you have anything else to conclude with that.
No, that like the other artist that comes to mind is like Ian Wilson, where you would have like these dinner conversations and then have timestamps of these like ongoing dialogues that we never get to see, but we know that they exist and they're continuous. I don't know that I don't know. That's something I may just have to journal about later, but I really appreciate you bringing it into the space so that I can start to think about it, because I think it can be really generative as I move forward in my practice. But I do just want to say thank you guys so much for attending, and thank you, Stephanie, for doing this with me. I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone, and thank you, Jazmine, for the invitation. This was a very cool conversation, not in terms of presenting, but now I have a lot of questions to fold back into my own practice, so thank you everyone.
So much. This has been such a great reflection on interviewing as a relational practice. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody for attending. Join us next week at 12:30.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you everyone.